For my 31st birthday, my mother-in-law handed me divorce papers in front of my unit at the army ball. My husband filmed it for their entertainment. I signed them calmly, then stood and announced she had no idea. The champagne glass made 3 small sounds against her ring. Tink, tink, tink. Around our table, conversation stopped. Beyond us, the ballroom still glowed blue and gold under the chandeliers, but the noise seemed to move farther away, the way sound does underwater. The jazz band softened without anyone signaling them to. Silverware paused over half-finished plates. At the front of the room, the empty place setting for fallen soldiers stood under its single light, untouched, the way it always is. It was my 31st birthday. My mother-in-law smiled at me like she'd been waiting for this exact moment for a year, maybe longer. "We wanted to give you something meaningful," she said, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "After all, your whole life is about service." My husband lifted his phone and pointed the camera at my face. His sister covered her mouth. She was already laughing, or trying not to, which is somehow worse. My mother-in-law slid a glittering pink envelope across the tablecloth. "So tonight," she said, "we decided to serve you." I already knew what was inside. I'd known for 2 weeks, but I hadn't told them that, and I wasn't going to start now. In a ballroom full of my chain of command, under a chandelier that threw little coins of light across the tablecloth every time someone moved. Inside were divorce papers, already signed on his end. She leaned closer, perfume and champagne on her breath. "My son deserves a real wife," she said. "Someone who can elevate this family, not someone who spends her life playing in the dirt." They expected tears, maybe shouting, maybe a scene they could replay later over drinks back in Dallas, something to tell at the next dinner party, a story with a punchline about the sergeant who married up and never learned how to act like it. I am a sergeant in Army logistics. For most of my marriage, my husband's family treated that title like something to apologize for at dinner parties. That night, at that table, under those lights, they mistook my silence for defeat. It was the most expensive mistake they ever made. But to understand how we got to that ballroom, how a woman who led 40 soldiers through a live fire exercise without blinking ended up sitting still while her mother-in-law handed her a pink envelope like a party favor, you have to go back. 2 years back, to a marriage I walked into believing it meant joining a family, and slowly learned meant something else entirely. I came from a small, ordinary home, the kind where people wrapped Christmas presents in whatever paper was left in the closet. My father drove a delivery truck for 22 years. My husband came from a different world entirely. Highland Park, old Dallas money, private clubs with waiting lists that outlived the people on them, portraits of dead relatives watching from paneled walls. We met at a mutual friend's engagement party. He made a joke about the caterer's tiny food. I laughed because it was actually funny, and that was the whole beginning. For months, none of it mattered. His family, mine, the gap between them. He drove 2 hours to see me on weekends. He learned the names of everyone in my unit before he'd met them, because I'd mentioned someone once and he'd remember. I didn't meet his mother until we'd been together almost a year. When it finally happened, we had dinner at their house, 6 courses, a housekeeper refilling water glasses before they were even half empty. She was careful, polite. She asked what I did. "Logistics," she repeated. "How interesting. Is that administrative? Supply chain and equipment movement for the battalion," I said. "It sounds simple." "It isn't." She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided not to hear you. "Well, I'm sure it's very important work." I didn't clock it that night as anything more than an awkward first dinner. It wasn't until years later that I understood it had been the opening move in something much longer. We married 18 months after that. My side of the family in one section, his in another, a line down the middle of the guest list nobody acknowledged out loud. His mother left before the reception's first dance was over, citing a headache I now suspect was never real. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Italy, paid for by his parents. Generosity, I thought then. An investment in a marriage they were already quietly hoping wouldn't last, I understand now. We came home tan and happy and completely unprepared for what was waiting. The first week after we got back from Italy, my mother-in-law hosted a cocktail party. Nothing unusual, she told me on the phone beforehand, just a few close friends, a chance to properly introduce the new bride to everyone who mattered. I remember spending almost $200 I didn't really have on a navy dress because I wanted to get this right, wanted to walk in looking like I belonged there even if I didn't fully believe it yet. Their house was lit up like a magazine spread when we pulled into the circular driveway. String lights in the trees. A bartender working a table set up on the back terrace. 40 or 50 people I'd never met. All of them holding drinks and having conversations that seemed to already be in progress. Like I'd walked into the middle of a movie everyone else had seen the beginning of. My mother-in-law found us within minutes of our arrival, looped her arm through mine with a kind of proprietary warmth that I mistook that night for genuine affection. She steered me toward the fireplace where 2 women stood talking, both of them dressed in the kind of effortless expensive that takes real money to look effortless in. "Ladies," she said, "I want you to meet my son's wife." A beat, just long enough that I felt it before I understood why. "She's a sergeant." I want to be precise about what happened to that word in her mouth because I've thought about it 1,000 times since. It didn't come out sounding like a rank, like an achievement, like something I'd worked 8 years to earn. It came out sounding like an apology she was making on my behalf, like she was warning them before they could be surprised by it themselves. One of the women, I never did catch her name, gave my husband a look, sympathetic. The kind of look you give someone whose dog just died, not someone whose wife just walked in the room. The other one turned to me with a bright, careful smile. "And do you think you'll do something a bit more settled after the army? Once you two start a family?" I opened my mouth to answer. I had an answer, actually. I was 3 years into a career I loved, working toward promotion, nowhere close to done. But before I could get a word out, my mother-in-law had already pulled my husband's sister into the circle, one hand hand on her shoulder, beaming. His sister's just gotten engaged, she announced, to nobody and everybody, to a cardiologist. A real professional. The two women turned their full attention to her immediately, cooing over the ring, asking about the wedding date, the venue, the honeymoon. I stood there for a moment, holding a glass of wine I hadn't touched, invisible in a conversation that had started because of me. My husband squeezed my hand under the fold of my dress, where nobody else could see it. At the time, I told myself that gesture meant something, that it was solidarity. A silent, "I see this. I'm sorry. I'm on your side." It took me years to understand what it actually meant. It meant, don't make this harder than it has to be. It meant, let it go. It meant, more than anything else, that his instinct in the moment his wife was quietly diminished in front of a room of strangers was not to defend her, but to manage her reaction to being diminished. There's a difference between those two things, and I didn't know how big a difference until I'd lived inside it for 2 more years. I found him again near the bar, an hour later, laughing at something one of his old college friends had said. I asked quietly if he'd noticed what happened by the fireplace. "She didn't mean anything by it," he said. "That's just how she talks. You'll get used to it." I did not, in fact, get used to it. What happened instead is that I got better at predicting it, which is a different skill entirely, and a much sadder one to have to develop about your own family. Thanksgiving that year was at their house, obviously. Everything of significance happened at their house. There was a new tradition where everyone went around the table and said what they were grateful for. When it was my turn, I said I was grateful for my soldiers, for the chance to serve something bigger than myself. She laughed, not unkindly exactly, that was the maddening part, and said, "Well, every family needs someone who does that kind of work." Nobody laughed with her. Nobody corrected her either. My husband studied his plate with an intensity turkey and stuffing had never required from anyone. Christmas was worse, though it took me longer to understand why, because on the surface it looked like generosity. She gave my husband a vintage watch that had belonged to his grandfather, wrapped with a small speech about legacy. She gave his sister a trip to Paris, flights included. My gift was a paperback about transitioning out of military service into civilian trade work. Folded inside the front cover was a set of hospital scrubs, still in the plastic. Her fiancé works with the hospital system, she said, watching my face as I unfolded them. Perhaps he could help you find something in housekeeping. Once you're ready to move on from all this. I held the scrubs in my lap for a long moment. My husband sat beside me, looking at some fixed point on the far wall, like a man waiting out a storm he'd decided wasn't his to weather. I remember that room in more detail than I probably should. The smell of pine, the candle burning low on the mantel, the specific quality of the silence that followed, which wasn't silence at all, but the sound of 11 people collectively deciding not to say anything. Nobody did. My husband said nothing that night, or the next morning, or for the 11 months that followed, until the night everything finally cracked open. 6 months before the army ball, I came home early from a training exercise that had been cut short by weather. I let myself in through the garage, the way I always did, and I heard my husband's voice from the kitchen before I saw him. Low, careful, the particular register people use when they don't want to be overheard. I know, Mom. I'll figure it out. I stood in the mudroom for a second, keys still in my hand, and by the time I walked into the kitchen, he was already ending the call, setting his phone face down on the counter like that would make whatever had just happened disappear. His phone lit up again almost immediately with a text message, and because it was sitting face up now, he'd turned it back over without thinking. I saw the preview before he grabbed it. Her name at the top, 2 lines beneath it. She can't find out. Handle it. What was that about? I asked. Nothing. Then, seeing my face, backtracking slightly, it's complicated. Try me. He sat down at the kitchen counter and rubbed both hands over his face, the way he did when he was working up to saying something he didn't want to say. The coffee between us had gone cold an hour ago. Neither of us had touched it since I'd walked in. My inheritance, he said finally, isn't unconditional. There are expectations about how the family presents itself publicly, and I don't fit the expectations. She thinks people judge us, he said, which was not a denial, and we both understood it wasn't a denial, even as he said it like one. And what do you think? He stared at the cold coffee for a long time before he answered, long enough that I understood the answer was going to disappoint me before he ever opened his mouth. I think it's complicated, he said again, like the phrase itself was a life raft he could keep climbing back onto. It wasn't complicated. His mother had told him in some fashion that my presence was a liability to his inheritance, and instead of telling her his marriage wasn't a line item to be managed, he'd chosen, quietly, in 100 small moments I was only beginning to add up, to manage me instead. I wasn't ready to accept that yet. I told myself it was one bad conversation, that I was tired from the exercise, reading too much into a call I'd only caught the tail end of. I kept telling myself that for another month, right up until the night I overheard the rest of it. I'd come home to grab a folder I'd forgotten, planning to be in and out in under a minute, and I heard them on the phone again. Him in his study this time, door half open, voice pitched low the way it had been that morning in the kitchen. I stood in the hallway, holding my running shoes because I'd been about to head out, and I listened to something I was never supposed to hear. You have to choose, she was saying, loud enough that even the phone speaker couldn't fully soften it. Her or this family's future. You cannot have both, and you know that. A long pause. I stood barefoot in that hallway, running shoes dangling from one hand, waiting, genuinely waiting, some small, stupid, hopeful part of me still waiting, for my husband to say something in my defense. Anything. Even a weak version of defense would have been something. Instead, he sighed, the particular sigh of a man setting down a weight he'd decided wasn't worth carrying anymore. I know, Mom, he said. I'll handle it. I didn't confront him that night. I put my shoes down quietly and drove to the gym instead of running my usual route, because I needed somewhere to put whatever was moving through my chest. But something in me had already changed. That sentence, "I'll handle it," said about his own wife to his own mother, with the door only half closed, ended the marriage. Not on paper, not yet, but in every way that actually matters. That was the night it ended. I didn't confront him after that phone call. I did what I'd been trained to do when the ground shifts under you: assess, then plan. My first plan was officer candidate school. Some part of me believed that if a sergeant embarrassed them, a lieutenant might force some baseline of respect. Wrong reason, but it gave me forward motion at a time I felt like I was standing still. I enrolled in online courses that fall. Alarm at 4:30, PT before sunrise, 10-hour shifts, then a desk in the corner of our bedroom under a second-hand lamp until well past midnight. My husband complained about the typing, the light, that I was no fun anymore. I finished the first semester with a 4.0 and sat alone in my truck afterward looking at the grade report, wanting to call someone, realizing there wasn't really anyone at home who'd want to hear it. The trouble came when I needed his signature on financial forms for the next round. I laid them on the kitchen table one Saturday morning. He glanced at them for maybe 3 seconds before he swept them onto the linoleum with the back of his hand. "More debt," he said, "for this fantasy. Look at yourself. You are not officer material." He didn't shout it. That's what I remember. The flat, bored certainty of someone correcting a child who'd gotten a simple fact wrong. "My mother is right," he added. "You need a realistic plan." I picked the papers up off the floor after he left the room. One had a coffee ring on the corner now, dark and warped. I sat at that table a long time and felt something in me go quiet in a way that frightened me more than shouting would have. I stopped the classes not long after. Told myself it was practical. Schedule, sustainability, all the reasonable-sounding explanations a person gives themselves when the real reason is too painful to say out loud. I started applying for civilian logistics jobs in secret instead. Every application disappeared into the silence of automated rejection. No interviews, no callbacks, nothing. It wasn't until the divorce, going through discovery, that I learned why. My mother-in-law had made calls to people in her network, people who sat on hiring committees, and described me, in language pulled from emails we later obtained, as unstable, difficult, unqualified for anything beyond entry-level work. At the time, all I knew was that every door felt sealed shut from the other side, and I had no idea someone had been quietly turning the locks. One night, maybe 2 weeks after the last rejection email, I found myself sitting in my truck in the parking lot outside the unit headquarters instead of driving home. I don't fully remember deciding to stop there. I just remember pulling in, killing the engine, and staying. I put my forehead against the steering wheel and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry in months. Not the tidy, contained kind of crying you do when you're aware of an audience. The other kind. Rain had started sometime while I sat there. I only noticed it because of the sound on the windshield. A soft, steady static, and a yellow security light above the lot flickered every few seconds, the bulb clearly on its way out, throwing everything into a strange, intermittent glow. Someone knocked on the window. I startled hard enough that I hit my elbow on the door. First Sergeant Michael Carter stood outside in the rain, no umbrella, holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the 24-hour gas station down the road. He was in his 50s, quiet, precise, one of those men who noticed everything and said almost none of it out loud unless it mattered. I rolled down the window, already trying to compose myself, already starting an apology I didn't get to finish. "Nothing to apologize for, Hall," he said, and handed me one of the cups through the gap in the window. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask why I was sitting alone in a dark parking lot at 9 at night crying hard enough to fog up my own windshield. He just stood there in the rain, looking out across the empty lot, giving me a kind of privacy that somehow felt more respectful than if he'd looked away entirely. The coffee was terrible. Gas station coffee always is. I drank it anyway, both hands wrapped around the cup for the warmth more than anything. "Whatever's happening outside that gate," he said eventually, still not looking directly at me, "it doesn't change what's true inside it. You're one of the strongest NCOs in this company. Your soldiers trust you. You solve problems other people avoid solving. That's fact, Hall. Not encouragement, fact." I started crying again at that, which embarrassed me, but it was a different kind of crying than before. Not because his words hurt, but because they were the first genuinely honest kindness I'd been handed in what felt like a very long time. Everything at home had become so carefully managed, so full of things people said to keep the peace or avoid a scene, that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to hear something true just because it was true. He nodded once toward the gate, toward the road beyond it that led back to my house, back to a marriage that had started to feel like a slow negotiation I kept losing. "Don't let people out there," he said. "Take what you earned in here." Before he walked back to his own car, he mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd caught an error in an award packet of mine a few weeks earlier and fixed it himself without saying anything, quietly making sure my record reflected what I'd actually earned. That cup of bad coffee didn't fix anything. My marriage was still unraveling, but something in me steadied that night. It didn't rescue me. Nobody else was ever going to rescue me. But it reminded me, at a moment I badly needed reminding, that I was still capable of rescuing myself. About 2 months after that night in the parking lot, something happened that I genuinely believed, at the time, was a turning point. My husband came home from a work trip different than he'd left, softer. He found me in the kitchen, unprompted, and said he wanted to really talk. Not the kind of talking we'd been doing for a year, which was mostly 2 people avoiding the actual subject. He held both my hands across the table and said he'd been thinking on the flight back about the man he wanted to be, that he'd spent 2 years managing me instead of defending me, and that he was ashamed of it. "I want to fix this," he said. "I want to be someone who stands next to you instead of watching from a distance." I cried too, but it was hope this time. He said he was going to set a real boundary with his mother for the first time in his life. For about 3 weeks it seemed to hold. He was warmer, present. When his mother made an offhand comment about my little army thing on the phone, I heard him from the next room tell her he'd appreciate it if she didn't talk about my career that way. Small. But it was the first time in 2 years I'd heard him push back on her at all, and I let myself believe the corner had been turned. I stopped quietly researching apartments on my phone during lunch breaks. I let myself imagine a future again. Then his mother invited us to Sunday dinner, and I watched 3 weeks unravel in about 20 minutes. It wasn't dramatic. That was the worst part. It was the way he laughed a beat too long at a joke she made at my expense. The way, when she listed a family trip without including me, he simply didn't correct her. The careful practiced silence sliding back into place across his face the moment we walked through her door, like a mask he'd set down for 3 weeks and was now, without announcement, putting back on. I asked him about it in the car, gently. Not an accusation, just a question. You're reading too much into it, he said. I can't fix 20 years of family dynamics in 3 weeks. Be reasonable. Be reasonable. I turned that phrase over for days because it struck me as a strange thing to say about a pattern that had been the entire subject of his tearful promise not 1 month earlier. I didn't feel angry yet. I felt something closer to grief for a version of him I'd been allowed to believe in for 3 weeks, who'd apparently existed only long enough to get me to stop looking for the exit, then quietly checked back out. I didn't confront him again after that car ride. I'd learned that confrontation with him produced apologies that cost him nothing and changed nothing. Instead, I started looking at the exit not as a possibility, but as a plan. A week before the ball, a message landed in my LinkedIn inbox from a senior talent lead at a defense contractor called Aegis Solutions. I almost didn't open it. I'd stopped checking that account regularly months earlier, after the string of automated rejections had made the whole platform feel like a waste of time, a place where my profile just sat gathering digital dust while nothing came of it. I found your profile through a logistics leadership group, she'd written. We're building out a new integration team for a contract based in Austin, and your background in military supply chain, team leadership, and high-pressure operations is exactly the kind of experience we're struggling to find. I read the message twice before I let myself believe it was real, and not some recruiting spam that would evaporate into a sales pitch the moment I responded. Then I got to the line that made me set my phone down on the counter and just sit with it for a minute. Your military experience is not something to transition away from, she'd written. It is an invaluable asset. Invaluable. I turned that word over in my head more times than I probably needed to. My mother-in-law used that word, when she used it at all, for things like diamonds, or the Hall family trust, or the china her own mother had passed down to her. It wasn't a word I'd ever heard applied to me. Not once. Not by anyone in that family. Not in 2 years of dinners and holidays and careful, polite conversations that always somehow circled back to what I lacked rather than what I had. A stranger. Someone who'd never sat across from me at a table, who had no idea what my voice sounded like or how I took my coffee, used that word for me in the second paragraph of a cold outreach message. I replied within the hour. We scheduled a call for the following afternoon. The interview happened over video, and it was nothing like what I'd braced myself for. The man on the other end introduced himself as a retired Navy captain, now running the department the recruiter had mentioned, and he spent the first several minutes just asking about my day-to-day work. Not the resume version, the real version, the 12-hour shifts and the equipment nobody else wanted to track, and the small daily disasters that never made it into an award packet. Then he asked how I handled failure. Not success, failure. Nobody had ever asked me that in a job interview before. It caught me off guard enough that I answered honestly instead of reaching for something polished. I told him about a midnight convoy reroute from 18 months earlier, critical parts moving between 3 units, all of them blaming each other for the delay, radios cutting in and out because of terrain, and a deadline that didn't care about any of it. I told him how I'd pulled up the map at 2 in the morning, reassigned drivers, called every point of contact myself instead of routing through channels, and had every single piece of equipment confirmed in place before the sun came up. He didn't say anything for a second after I finished. Then, that's the job. Different clothes, same pressure. We talked for another 20 minutes after that about the Austin contract, about the team he was building, about what a first 90 days might look like. It felt less like an interview and more like 2 people who did the same kind of work comparing notes, which was a feeling I hadn't had in longer than I wanted to admit. Not at home, not anywhere. The offer arrived the next morning before I'd even finished my coffee. Project manager, logistics, and integration. Austin, Texas. $85,000 a year, full benefits, relocation assistance covered start to finish. It was nearly double what I made in uniform. It was more than my husband made, a fact I noticed and then immediately felt strange for noticing, as though even acknowledging it privately, to myself, in my own kitchen, was some kind of betrayal I hadn't earned the right to commit yet. I didn't print it at home. I drove to the education center on base that afternoon and used the library printer instead, because some instinct in me, the same instinct maybe, that had once told me to keep applying for jobs in secret, didn't want that piece of paper anywhere near our home printer, didn't want it sitting in a queue where anyone else might see it before I was ready. I folded it twice, small enough to fit in my palm, and tucked it into the black clutch I already knew I'd be carrying to the ball. Then the fear moved in, the way it always seemed to, right on schedule, the moment something good arrived without permission from anyone but me. It didn't come from any single conversation. It came from years of accumulated messaging, absorbed so thoroughly I could produce it in my own voice now without anyone else in the room. Her voice, telling me I wasn't officer material. His voice, telling me to be reasonable. The two of them, in their different registers, both saying some version of the same thing, that I would fail out there without a family name behind me, that the offer was a fluke or a mistake that would reveal itself as such within a few months, that I'd end up with nothing. No marriage, marriage, since that was already circling the drain by then, whether I admitted it or not. No army, since I'd have to separate to take the job. No safety net, no fallback, no family. His family, at least. To catch me if Aegis turned out to be exactly the kind of overpromise I was terrified it might be. For 2 full days, I couldn't bring myself to reply to the offer email. I read it probably 30 times. I drafted an acceptance twice and deleted it both times before hitting send, telling myself I needed to think it over more, when really what I needed was permission from someone, anyone, to believe I deserved it. I found First Sergeant Carter in the motor pool that Saturday morning, elbow deep in a maintenance issue with one of the trucks, and I asked him, without much of a preamble because I didn't trust myself to build up to it gracefully, how a person is supposed to know the difference between still fighting for something worth fighting for and finally admitting that it isn't going to work no matter how hard you throw yourself at it. He wiped his hands on a rag, took his time answering, the way he always did. Carter was not a man who filled silence just because it was there. You know the Serenity Prayer? He asked. I told him I knew the version everyone knows. Accept what you cannot change, change what you can. Most people stop there, he said, but there's a third part people forget. Wisdom to know the difference. That's the part that actually takes work. He set the rag down on the truck's fender. You can't change people who are committed to misunderstanding you, Hall. I've watched you try for 2 years now, near as I can tell, without ever saying so directly. Stop throwing yourself against that particular door. It's not going to open, and even if it did, I'm not convinced what's on the other side is worth walking into. And the job? That's the part you can change. He looked at me directly then, in the way he rarely did, most of his attention usually reserved for whatever piece of equipment was in front of him, rather than the person he was talking to. If another door's standing open, and you're afraid to walk through it, that's not fate making the decision for you. That's fear, wearing their voice, because it's easier to listen to a voice you already know than to trust one you don't recognize yet, even when that new voice happens to be your own. I didn't say anything for a while after that. I just stood there in the motor pool, surrounded by the smell of diesel and cut grass from whoever had mowed the lot that morning, turning his words over the way I'd turned over Invaluable a week earlier, except this time I understood clearly what I was supposed to do with them. I accepted the offer before I even drove home that afternoon, sitting in my truck in the same parking lot where he'd once handed me a cup of bad coffee in the rain, typing the reply on my phone before I could talk myself out of it a third time. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm pleased to accept. It felt smaller than the moment probably deserved, typing 11 words into a phone screen in a parking lot. But some of the most important decisions of my life have looked exactly that unremarkable from the outside, and I'd learned by then not to wait for a moment to feel as large as its actual consequences before trusting it. 2 nights before the ball, my husband left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went upstairs to shower. I want to be honest that I wasn't looking for anything. I'd walked in to get a glass of water, and the screen was simply there, still lit, an email thread open on it that I could see clearly from 3 feet away without even trying. I almost looked away. I want that on the record too, because it would be easy, telling the story after the fact, to make myself sound more deliberate than I actually was in that moment. But a subject line caught my eye before I could redirect it. A thread with the family's longtime lawyer, a man who'd handled 3 generations of the family's business, and whom I'd met exactly twice, both times at events where he'd shaken my hand and then spent the rest of the evening talking to everyone except me. I read the most recent message. The terms look good, it said, in my husband's voice, in his particular clipped writing style that I'd have recognized blindfolded after 2 years of texts and emails. Proceed with service at the event as planned. Service. That was the word they'd landed on, apparently, in writing, days in advance of the actual night, as though what was coming was a delivery to be scheduled rather than the end of a marriage being staged for an audience. I scrolled up, and I want to say I hesitated before I did, but the truth is I didn't hesitate at all. I read the whole thread, standing at that counter, water glass forgotten, while the shower ran upstairs. It went back almost 3 weeks. There were logistics discussed. Which of my commanding officers would likely be seated closest to us? A note from the lawyer's office confirming the paperwork would be fully executed on my husband's end before the event, so that all that would remain was my signature. A line from my mother-in-law, forwarded into the thread, that read simply, "Good. Let's make it memorable." I closed the laptop gently, the way you close something when you don't want the person upstairs to know it had ever been open. Then I went to bed, because there was nothing left to say to him that his own words, in his own inbox, hadn't already said far more clearly than any conversation between us was likely to. He wasn't a man caught helplessly between his wife and his mother, the way I think some small, stubborn part of me had still been holding out hope he might turn out to be, right up until that moment. He'd picked a side weeks earlier. He'd helped plan the exact evening, the exact staging, the exact audience for the moment he intended to announce it. The night of the ball itself, I laid my service uniform out on the bed and went through the whole ritual I'd gone through 100 times before every formal event, polishing every button until it threw back a clean reflection, checking my ribbons against the reference card I still kept from initial training even though I'd long since had the order memorized, making sure my rank insignia sat exactly where regulations said it should sit, not a fraction of an inch off. My mother-in-law had always looked at that uniform. On the rare occasions she looked at it directly at all, like it was proof of something beneath her, proof that her son had married down, married someone whose accomplishments came stitched onto fabric instead of engraved on a law firm's letterhead, or listed after a medical degree. I put it on that night knowing exactly what it actually proved, which was closer to the opposite of what she'd always assumed. 2 years inside that family, and I had never once needed her approval to know what I'd earned. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment before I left the bedroom. Whatever was about to happen in that ballroom, I told myself, I already knew something they didn't. I straightened my collar one more time, picked up the black clutch from the dresser, and went downstairs to where my husband was waiting by the door, already checking his watch. Already, I now understood, thinking about camera angles. At the ballroom, First Sergeant Carter and his wife sat 2 seats down from us. My mother-in-law wore dark silk. His sister kept checking her phone. My husband's hand was damp when it touched my back, guiding me toward the table, and I remember thinking even then that a nervous hand is a confession all its own. Then came the champagne glass against her ring. Tink, tink, tink. The pink envelope sliding across the tablecloth, the camera already lifted. Something meaningful, she said. Since your whole life is about service. I opened it. Divorce papers, already signed on his end. What none of them knew is that I'd read the email thread with the family lawyer 2 weeks before they ever staged this moment. Long before the pink paper, long before the champagne glass, long before any of them had finished congratulating themselves on the ambush they thought was still a surprise. So I didn't cry. I took the government pen from my clutch, clicked it once, signed my name on the line their lawyer had marked, and slid the papers back across the table. Thank you, I said. This may be the most useful gift you've ever given me. Her smile disappeared. My husband lowered the phone. That's it. No. I reached into the clutch and unfolded the Aegis offer letter, laying it flat where the divorce papers had just been. I told them the title, the salary, the relocation package. I didn't editorialize. I just stated the facts, the way I'd state them in a briefing. You spent 3 years telling me my career was beneath this family, I said, looking at her. Aegis called it invaluable. So tonight, I'm giving myself a promotion instead. His sister's phone slipped out of her hand and cracked against her plate. My husband's face emptied of color. My mother-in-law opened her mouth, and for the first time in 2 years, no polished sentence arrived to fill it. First Sergeant Carter stood first, raised his glass, his voice carrying well past our table. To Sergeant Hall, he said. For her birthday, her new position, and the future she earned. Soldiers around the ballroom stood. Their spouses followed. Glasses rose across 2 full tables. The battalion commander crossed the room, shook my hand, told me Aegis was fortunate to have me, one of the finest NCOs in his command. He didn't know the whole story behind that sentence. He didn't need to. His respect made the silence at our table impossible to hide from. I didn't give a speech. I picked up my clutch, thanked First Sergeant Carter with a nod, and walked out of that ballroom into the cool, damp Texas night, taking the first full breath I could remember taking in over a year. I wasn't happy yet, but I was free. The second reveal came during the divorce itself. My attorney specialized in military family law, and when I described the ball to her, the champagne glass, the phone camera, the pink envelope, she stopped writing partway through. He filmed it? Yes. And his sister was there, watching, laughing? Yes. She leaned back in her chair. They created evidence of planned public cruelty, she said. That's going to matter more than you think. Through discovery, my husband was required to produce the video, the messages, and the full email chain with the family lawyer. The footage showed his mother smiling while she insulted my career in front of witnesses. It showed his sister laughing behind her hand. It showed him holding the camera steady on my face the entire time I opened the envelope. The emails confirmed the ball had been chosen deliberately because my chain of command would be present. They had believed they were documenting my collapse. What they'd actually documented was their own intent. The court didn't award me some fantasy fortune. It gave me something more useful: protection. I kept my truck, my savings, my retirement accounts, and every benefit I'd earned. My husband's attempt to paint me as unstable failed for the simplest reason. His own video showed exactly the opposite. I stayed composed throughout. He and his family did not. My husband's text changed shape as the consequences accumulated. Anger, then blame, then something closer to fear, and finally, near the end, something that almost looked like love. I made a mistake. We can fix this. I didn't answer any of them. The last time I saw him, rain was coming down in the barracks parking lot. I'd finished my out processing and was carrying a folder of final paperwork to my truck when he pulled up beside me and got out without an umbrella, his shirt darkening within seconds. Wait, he looked exhausted, younger than I remembered him looking in a long time. We could go to counseling. I love you. For one unguarded second, I grieved. Not for the marriage as it had actually been, but for the marriage I'd spent 2 years hoping it might still become. Then the grief passed, the way weather does. No, I said. You love the version of me that stayed quiet enough to keep your life comfortable. What am I supposed to do now? He asked. And in that question, I finally heard clearly that he was still asking me to manage the consequences of choices he alone had made. Your life belongs to your mother, I told him. Mine belongs to me. I got in my truck and drove away. At the first gas station past the gate, I pulled over and blocked his number. 18 months later, my office sits on the 22nd floor of a building near downtown Austin. Frosted glass on the door carries my name and the words Senior Project Manager. I bought a small condo near the park. The first night there, furniture still weeks out, I sat on the floor eating takeout and realized the quiet didn't frighten me the way quiet used to. No one was angry in the next room. No one was measuring my worth against a family name. Last spring, Fort Cavazos asked me to speak to soldiers preparing to leave the service. I stood at a podium facing a room full of the same guarded expression I used to wear myself, the fear that the civilian world wouldn't understand what they were capable of. You already know how to lead when you're exhausted, I told them. Decide with incomplete information. Keep moving when the plan collapses. Don't erase those skills just to make someone else comfortable. First Sergeant Carter sat in the front row, retired now, no rank on his shirt, smiling. I didn't think about the ballroom that day. I didn't think about the pink envelope or the camera or the champagne glass against her ring. Their part in my life had finally gone quiet. That's what healing turned out to look like. Not winning every argument, not watching anyone suffer, just reaching a day when their voices no longer narrated mine.